fair deal of regret that what's come to be known as Bloody Friday took place. I was one of the key movers on that particular day.
I was only witnessing Bloody Friday. At that point, I went over the edge, I suppose. The following Sunday, I joined the UVF. I wanted to sort of hit back, and I wanted to hit back with absolute ruthlessness.
Do you have a problem with committing all this to secret tape to be used only after you have died?
I don't have a problem with that. If I did have a problem with that, I would be sitting here talking into a microphone. I think a lot of the stuff that I'm saying here, I'm saying it in trust because I have a trust in you. And I have never, ever, ever admitted to being a member of the IRA. Never. I've just done it here.
And I don't know that anybody ever knew how it was going to all end. We were just locked in it. That's why I call it the hamster wheel to hell.
The partition of Ireland during the War of Independence resulted in the creation of the Northern Ireland state. It was ruled from Stormont by a pro-British Unionist party that was supported by the majority Protestant community. The nationalist Catholic minority generally felt excluded and alienated. From the very beginning, that division would define the state's identity. It was this society that produced Brendan Hughes and David Ervine, just 2 miles apart in the divided city of Belfast.
At that time, Catholics were largely discriminated against, and the old adage of a Protestant country for Protestant people was very much in vogue. I was brought up in a Protestant area, Blackwater Street and the Grosvenor Road, the only Catholic house in the street. My mother died when she was very young. She was 31 years of age. My father was left with 6 children, 5 boys and 1 girl. We as a Catholic family in the area were constantly singled out. I mean, I was arrested, God knows how many times, for not having lights on the bike, for not having brakes on the bike, for playing cards in the street, for playing football in the street. There was one old woman, she was in her 90s. Every time I walked past her door, she would spit on me. She would shout, "Did you bless yourself with the Pope's piss this morning?"
Large parades every summer by the exclusively Protestant Orange Order antagonized many Catholics.
My father was in constant fights with the Orange Order, who would insist every year of putting the arch up outside our house, the only Catholic house in the street.
Across the River Lagan, David Ervine was raised in the heart of Protestant East Belfast.
I was born between the Albert Bridge Road and Newtonards Road. Very basic working class community, I suppose, close enough to be described as in the shadow of the shipyard. I was the youngest of 5 children. My dad was a very skilled tradesman. I would have described him as a very, very liberal man. My mother would have been the opposite. One at the left of Joe Stanley, I went to right of Genghis Khan. Well, my father was, in truth, sickened by politics in Northern Ireland, and I remember Paisley campaigning in our street, and my dad, in language that was shocking to me, told Paisley to fuck off. In a street that probably had about 100 houses, I think there were 4 Catholic families. They were lovely, they were fine people, but then you see, I don't know that you were ever frightened of the Catholic they knew. You were frightened of the Catholic you didn't know.
Freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. We do not wish bloodshed or violence.
In 1968, a civil rights movement demanding equal rights for Catholics exploded onto the streets of Northern Ireland.
The demands of the civil rights movement were basically for fair voting, for fair distribution of jobs, and for fair distribution of housing. Very modest indeed. They used to be expressed in terms of we want the same rights for the people of Belfast as are enjoyed by the people of Birmingham. The state reacted with complete paranoia. Couldn't afford to make any concession at all. Wasn't in their psyche, wasn't in their ideology to concede.
When you went out on a demonstration, the police beat you up. I think on our part it was a stubborn refusal to accept that not only were you not allowed to have equality, but you weren't allowed to complain about it.
In the Ervine household, the civil rights movement provoked intense debate.
The community view seemed to be one of, this is an enemy. This is a sinister plot. The sting was taken out of that by my dad. Just sort of saying, well, hold on a minute, you know. But certainly I probably would have fallen to the community view. You're either one of them or you're one of us, and I was one of us.
I'm a free-born Protestant, and all the intimidation will not stop me in my campaign in Ulster to keep Ulster out of the south of Ireland.
There was a palpable fear that the IRA were actually controlling the civil rights, and this was another way of overthrowing the country.
Brendan Hughes was caught up in the upheaval that was sweeping Northern Ireland.
I got involved in the riots that was taking place at that time. B specials, the IUC, the whole military might was geared towards suppressing and putting down these people, these riotous people, these people who are objecting to the state. Then the burning happened in Bombay Street.
Dawn over Belfast today showed a grim scene. Buildings scarred by fire, thousands of pounds worth of damage caused, and of course the tragic loss of life.
On the 15th of August 1969, the police reserve, the B Specials, helped loyalist rioters attack the nationalist Lower Falls. 8 people were killed and thousands were burnt out of their homes.
There were reports that B Specials were distributing guns to Protestants in Shankill, and that the Specials were driving through the streets in tenders and shooting anyone they could see.
The B Specials led them. When did you shoot back? Well, what with pea shooters and battles, armoured cars, paving the way for the hooligans to come in.
With Belfast and Derry descending into chaos, the British Army was called in to restore order.
When the Brits marched in 1680, I was standing at a barricade at the top of our street when the very first Brits walked onto the Falls Road. Next thing, women were getting tea and biscuits and stuff, so there was a great atmosphere.
I remember the army coming in, and the clear implication was that the unionist community were the aggressor. And I think that psychology was deeply damaging.
They were in to protect the enemies of the state, as far as unionist perceptions were. And if they stayed out, maybe the unions could have finished the job. Simple as that.
In West Belfast, The IRA was criticised by some for failing to prevent the burnings of August 1969.
There was no IRA there. There was no weapons there, and left the people unprotected. The IRA were not capable of protecting the people of 69.
Amid the recriminations that followed, the IRA split into official and provisional wings. Brendan Hughes was drawn to the new provisional's promise to defend nationalist areas. It was led by an old friend of his father's.
My father's great friend was a man called Billy McKee. We almost felt like genuflecting passing Billy's house because my father thought so much of him. I was approached by a guy, John Joe McGee, who was an ex-paratrooper, about joining the IRA. We were brought in and advised of what joining the IRA meant. Basically, it boiled down to either you're going to jail or you're going to die. That's what you can look forward to. I then became a volunteer in D Company 2nd Battalion, Belfast Brigade.
This combat zone was next door to the heavily loyalist Shankill Road and less than 400 yards from the city centre.
D Company 2nd Battalion embraced Lower Falls and Divis. From the Grosvenor Road down to the bottom of Townsend Street, the Falls Road, from Townsend Street over to the end of the corner of the Grosvenor Road, both sides of the Grosvenor Road, up as far as the Springfield Road. That was D Company.
After the swearing in, there'd be history classes, there'd be then going to weaponry and explosive classes. And that's where you found your niche then. What do you want to be? You want to be a gunman or do you want to be a bomber?
The RUC and the B Specials and the Stormont regime were initially the main target. The first operations were carried out against the RUC, and this consisted of a £5 charge of gelignite strapped onto a butcher's hook, hang the £5 charge on the door, light the fuse, and run like fuck.
The summer of 1970 gave the Provisional IRA a chance to show that it could prevent a repeat of the Loyalist burnings of 1969. The Orange marching season was in full swing, and Belfast was like a tinderbox. In East Belfast, an unruly loyalist crowd returning from an Orange parade gathered outside St Matthew's Catholic Church. IRA gunmen, led by Billy McKee, were waiting.
The Republican narrative of that day is that the Loyalists were about to invade the Short Strand and overwhelm a small Catholic enclave. Therefore, the IRA repelled the attack. However, the Loyalists coming back home into East Belfast, they say, no, we were fired on first. There were shots from St Matthews, and then all hell broke loose.
I was there the night in 1970 when 3 people were shot dead. I can remember a guy getting shot, and it was, it wasn't like the movies. And the blood spurted about 3 feet. It was horrendous. The noise, the sort of fear, the atmosphere, it was incredible stuff. It was an absolute war zone.
The lesson that we learned was that was never going to happen again to us. There was an organisation, UVF, based on the old style UVF of 1912. And that's whenever I introduced and formed the UVF in East Belfast, for the protection of the people.
Alarmed at the IRA's stand at St Matthew's, Unionists demanded that the British Army move against Republican areas. That would lead a week later to a confrontation on the Falls Road, which would change the course of the Troubles.
The house was wrecked. The house was an absolute shambles. We couldn't even live in it. The black and tans was bad enough, but they never had to put their foot on a holy picture. And
the British Army's aggressive house raids enraged the local community and provoked a fierce response.
That whole day there was a continual battle. Blast bombs been thrown at the British. Later on that afternoon, a helicopter arrived and announced over loudhailers that the Lower Falls was now under curfew, and anyone found on the streets would be shot.
The British Army curfew posed a formidable challenge to Hughes's small, poorly armed IRA unit.
There was 11 of us at that time in D Company, and we were going to break the curfew. We, one by one, we came out of Service Street and made our way along Service Street as a foot patrol. And the British immediately opened up. The Falls had been surrounded by British troops. We took cover in houses and continued to fire.
Stand still, you're under arrest for breaking the curfew.
I had run out of ammunition, I had no ammunition left.
Hughes recalled waiting out the curfew, which lasted 36 hours, in a local house.
And I was just sitting, waiting and waiting and waiting. Then I heard this noise, and it got closer and closer. Seen hundreds and hundreds of people passing the window with prams and children, and I could distinctly hear the people shouting, "Come out, the curfew's over." The weapons were handed over to the women who put them in the pram, and we mingled with the crowd and made our way out of the area.
Not only were people locked up in their houses for 36 hours, they had no food. The Brits raided all the shops and took all the groceries out and destroyed the place.
The Lower Falls curfew was a military disaster. It was the catalyst that turned the community against the army. Had that not happened, we may never have had 38 years of conflict.
That was the point of no return. After that, the British Army were getting no more tea in any nationalist area of the north.
As nationalists were turning against the British Army, many unionists felt the authorities were not being tough enough on the civil rights movement and the IRA. Some decided to take the law into their own hands.
The growth in paramilitarism came from vigilantism, that you were under attack and you were going to do something about it, and was one step away from defence to attack.
What motivated them was fury at the way in which they felt they'd been let down by the Protestant established political elite. They believed that if you were going to fight the IRA, then you had to do it with muscle, not with brains.
When I try to look back on what happened with me, I think I was inching in the direction of having to do something about this.
While David Ervine was moving towards getting involved, Brendan Hughes would cross the path of Gerry Adams during a street riot. Together, the two men would leave an indelible mark on the story of the Troubles.
I met Gerry for the first time during the riots, and Gerry was directing the rioters. I didn't know who he was, but he certainly stuck out as a leader because he was able to control and he was able to direct.
When the Troubles erupted, Adams was in almost a unique situation. He was from a Republican family. He was already in the IRA. He had a strategic vision. He was able to express ideas in a way that a lot of his comrades weren't able to do.
Adams was always the longer-term strategist. Hughes was always more the militarist.
Gerry Adams' publicly stated position has always been that he has never been a member of the IRA. Known as the Doc because of his swarthy complexion, Brendan Hughes' reputation was growing in the Lower Falls.
This was a liberated area where people like me was able to walk the streets with weapons over our shoulders. I was over every yard wall in the Lower Falls area, through every back door and through most people's houses. Everybody knew who we were.
His D Company unit was regularly taking on the British Army on the Falls Road.
Every regiment that came in went out with casualties.
People looked upon Brendan as a real soldier because in the Lower Falls at that time, the D Company were a very effective company. They were inflicting casualties on the Brits.
Former British soldier James White recalled his first encounter with Brendan Hughes.
There were about 2 platoons, about 60 men, along the Grosvenor Road. And at one point, some shots rang out. Brendan Hughes tried to shoot me. He missed me by a few feet. He had been flitting around in the back streets of Lower Falls, shooting with a handgun. As I raised my weapon, I cocked it to fire at him. An elderly lady informed me that I was shooting nobody in her street on that particular evening. By the time I'd shoved her back inside her home, the guy had disappeared. One of the things that always sticks in my mind about this, it's ridiculous really, but he was wearing a coat jacket, rather like this one, and he was firing a gun at soldiers. It was astonishing. I was absolutely gobsmacked. In some ways, there was a grudging admiration for this little bugger who had taken on an elite infantry unit with a handgun. He had to have some balls to do something like that. What?
Hughes believed that if the IRA was going to seriously challenge the British Army, they needed better weapons. He heard about a new rifle that could be bought in gun stores in the United States.
This weapon, an Armalite they called it, that this is the weapon we needed. It folded and it could be dumped in water. I loved them.
Combines the accuracy of a sniping rifle with the firepower of a machine gun.
Well, Armalite was a great big gun. It was very, very compact and it was lovely.
Hughes recalled travelling to New York to buy Armalites and finding a novel way of transporting them back to Belfast.
I name this ship Queen Elizabeth II. May God bless her and all who sail in her.
We had weapons coming in off the QE2. We had people working on the boat. A few of them were actually in the IRA, carrying the stuff on board, hiding it in their lockers, or on the boat somewhere. I would then go to Southampton and drive onto the boat to take the weapons off and send back to Belfast.
I remember 3 cars arrived into Leeson Street, 2 of them loaded with the Armalite weapons. Brendan was in one car. The scout car contained Gerry Adams. And of course it carried no guns, because Jerry didn't allow himself to be in the presence zones or in any situation which would put him at risk of arrest.
The Armalite was more than a match for the standard flak jacket. So the guys going out on the ground, the guys going out on the bricks on a day-to-day basis, knowing that there were people out there with better weapons than they were capable of deploying. Not a lot of fun.
As Brendan Hughes rose through the ranks of the IRA in West Belfast, he attracted the attention of British military intelligence.
I was standing the corner and a van drove down Leeson Street. And I noticed the driver was really shaking himself. I seen the back doors flying open. And they came running after me, firing. The bullets were whizzing off the wall all over the place. The operation was to assassinate me. I almost ran past the hall house. I grabbed the door as I was running, and the momentum carried me right through the window. I didn't realise how much blood I'd lost. I'd lost an awful lot. A doctor was called. Jerry went and organised a doctor. He put a pair of tweezers up and pulled it down, tied it to me now, stopped the bleeding. And then he got a needle and thread and sewed it up.
It was Jerry Adams who was instrumental in making arrangements for a doctor. Sew Brendan up, sew the artery to Gar. Brendan would say he saved Brendan's life.
Brendan treated Jerry like a brother. His family was the IRA, and his brother was Jerry Adams.
I have decided to exercise where necessary the powers of detention and internment.
In immediate aftermath of Bloody Sunday, people wanted to fight back. They wanted to hit back. And who was going to hit back other than people with guns? People queued to join the IRA after Bloody Sunday.
The war was so intense. You might have had 12, 14 operations taking place in the one day.
You'd be up maybe 8 o'clock in the morning. You go to your call house. Brendan will be there. You get laid out what you had to do. Who was going on snipes? Who was going on floats? Who was scouting?
You were robbing banks, robbing post offices, robbing trains, planting bombs, shooting Brits, trying to stay alive yourself, trying to stay from getting arrested.
What they were engaged in was sustained escalation, which would put the provisional IRA nose to nose with the British military. They had a single item agenda, which was a British declaration of intent to go.
The level of activity was such in Belfast that if you went out for a meal or went to the cinema or went for a walk in Belfast, you were never sure that you were going to come back in one piece.
I would come on the scene and there'd be dead people lying on the road. It was all real. I mean, it wasn't like this was once in a blue moon, once every month. It was every day this was happening.
In the midst of all this mayhem, Brendan Hughes got married.
I know the fact that Brendan was getting married, my father didn't agree with it. The simple fact that Brenton wasn't going to be about. Now, how can you get married when every British soldier and every RUC special branch officer's looking for you? It was unfair on Lily to have that sort of a life. I don't think really they had time to bond like normal husband and wives bond. Because Brett was always going to be on the run, or he was going to be dead, one or the other, you know.
As always in such explosions, some of the injuries were unspeakable.
With the situation spiralling out of control, the British shut down the local Stormont Parliament and brought in direct rule. They organised a ceasefire with the IRA and flew a delegation of them to London for talks. But the talks got nowhere.
The leadership of the IRA that was brought to London to have the talks realised straight away that the British were not going to deliver a withdrawal at that stage.
The IRA commander in Belfast concluded the British were only playing for time and ordered Brendan Hughes to break the truce in the middle of a housing dispute in West Belfast.
Give me specific instructions that when he raises his hand, right, for me to open fire.
The soldiers started shooting back. The war was on.
Bombs began going off in Belfast only about 2 hours after the IRA announced the end of the ceasefire.
After the ceasefire collapsed, the IRA set out to show that the violence would worsen unless the British began serious talks about leaving Northern Ireland.
The IRA admits responsibility for all the bombs.
It's 3 in the afternoon, and for the last 20 minutes, Belfast has been rocked by the biggest bombing offensive seen in the city this year.
I mean, I was responsible for a fair deal of the bombs going into the town. I wasn't directing my station to do this, but I was the person that organised it.
There was a tremendous explosion. And I ran out into the street. There was a big pile of, like, sausages, intestines lying on the top of a wall. And there were legs, some of them with women's shoes on. Terrible scenes, unimaginable.
And the bombs started to go off. Boom, 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 boom. And I remember a lot of the volunteers cheering and cheering, and I remember getting angry with them and shouting at them. I sort of knew, right, there was going to be casualties here. It was a major, major operation, but it was never, ever intended to kill people.
But with over 20 car bombs exploding one after the other in the city centre on a Friday afternoon, even with warnings, casualties were a virtual certainty.
I mean, if I could reverse the situation, I would. I have a fair deal of regret that Bloody Friday took place.
Bloody Friday was a disaster for the IRA. And just misjudged it badly.
This day would also alter the course of David Ervine's life.
It was only on the day of my 19th birthday, witnessing Bloody Friday, when there was a lad killed with the same name as me. And he lived close by, and people thought it was me, and it could have been me. At that point, I went over the edge, I suppose. Following Sunday, I joined the UVF.
The Ulster Volunteer Force was a secretive and extremely violent paramilitary group. In 1966, the organisation had been revived by a former British soldier, Gusty Spence.
You've got guns?
Yes.
And you're prepared to use them?
True.
Against?
Against anyone who would usurp the constitution of Ulster.
The UVF seemed to me to be the cutting edge, and that's where I wanted to be. I wanted to sort of hit back, and I wanted to hit back with an absolute ruthlessness. I joined in a hall in East Belfast, and along with a number of others. It was made very clear to me that out of this you could lose your relationship with your family, you could lose your life. You know, it was like, come on in and enjoy the Boy Scouts. That was not the case. I remember saying to the guy who was in charge of our wee group, I says, I won't do armed robberies. And he says, you'll do what you're told.
Bloody Friday also created a backlash against the IRA that allowed the British Army to occupy Republican strongholds, where they began to seriously recruit informers.
It's always a primary requirement of the army to find out what's happening on the ground. And if you can't actually see what's happening on the ground, then you go out and find people who can.
The IRA was especially ruthless in the way it dealt with those suspected of passing information to the British authorities. Brendan Hughes gave his account of one such case in late 1972, which set in motion what was to become one of the most notorious incidents of the whole Troubles.
Jean McConville, she had a load of kids. That time, there was flats, and was a major source of recruitment and activity by the IRA. She had a transmitter in her house. The British supplied the transmitter into her flat. We took her away, interrogated her, and she told what she was doing. She was getting paid by the British to pass on information.
Jean McConville was unlike any other alleged informer encountered by the IRA, a woman, a widow, and a mother of 10 children.
Because she was a woman, we let her go with a warning. A few weeks later, another transmitter was put into her house. She was still cooperating with the British. The special squad was brought in the operation then, called the Unknowns. You know, when anyone needed to be taken away, they normally done it. I had no control over this squad. Jerry had control over this particular squad.
Jerry Adams has always denied having any knowledge of the disappearance of Jean McConville. Jean McConville was taken across the border, where she was shot dead and her body secretly buried. With the conflict at its bloodiest, few in the IRA had any qualms about killing her. Brendan Hughes was no exception, although he strongly disagreed with hiding her body.
I knew she was being executed. I knew that. I didn't know she was going to be buried, right, or disappeared, as they call them now.
Hughes summed up the grim argument of those in the IRA who opposed disappearing her.
We're going to kill her, put her on the fucking street. What's the sense of killing her and burying her if no one knows what she was killed for?
The IRA never told her family what had happened to her.
Would she, do you think, stay away without telling you?
No.
Jean McConville's family has consistently denied that she had been an informer. More than 30 years later, the police ombudsman, Nuala O'Lone, authored a report that supported the family's position.
This can be on record, right? I am satisfied with both the Security Service and the British Army that she was not an informant for them. Absolutely satisfied.
Brendan Hughes' account differs sharply from that of Nuala O'Lone and Jean McConville's family.
Looking back on it now, what happened to the woman was wrong. I mean, she deserved to be executed, I believe, because she was an informer and she put other people's lives at risk. And
even with all her kids, the way the family was left, in hindsight, do you still feel strongly about executing her?
Not really, no. Not now. Not now.
Now deeply entrenched in Republican areas, the British Army began to tighten the net around the Belfast IRA leadership.
late spring, early summer of '73, we began to understand that there were players out there that really we needed to remove if we were going to have some sort of permanent or semi-permanent effect on the organisation.
In 1973, Jerry was OC of Belfast Brigade, I was operations officer. We met every day, planned what operations were going to take place, and next step in the war. That's what we were doing the day we were arrested. Within seconds, the house was surrounded. They charged into the house, arrested us, brought us to Springfield Road Police Station. And I was tied to a chair, beaten with small hammers and punched, kicked, interrogated. They just beat the crap out of me. Adams passed out, I think it was 3 times, and they revived him with buckets of water.
Officially, the Army regards today's arrests as the most important in any single day. Unofficially, as one Army officer put it, you could say the boys are right over the moon.
We were marched out, put on a helicopter, and flew to Lancash.
I had Hughes handcuffed to my right wrist, Adams to my left wrist. And when we landed, the whole of the place was alive with prisoners standing on the Nissen hut roofs, clapping, whistling and cheering. Hughes and Adams were welcomed as stars. I think we all began to have a little bit of regret that we hadn't had the opportunity to do more with them.
I was under so much pressure. It was an actual relief to get into Lancash. But as soon as I got there, I started to plan my escape.
It took Hughes and Adams into the University of Lancash, so to speak, and helped them to rethink their strategy as to whether the short, sharp military victory was attainable.
We became Irish Republican revolutionaries. Adams here was a revolutionary socialist. His point of view was that we must turn out politically educated, rank and file. I was reading Che Guevara and Fidel Castro's speeches.
For Brendan, the socialist thing was the key to it. He believed that the United Ireland wasn't worth one life if it didn't change the conditions of the lowest in society, the working class.
But outside the prison, the arrest of Hughes and Adams was a major blow to the IRA. With morale and attacks plummeting, the decision was made for Hughes to escape.
Brendan was actually chosen for the escape because of his organisational abilities were sorely needed outside. Better having him outside than maybe 10 lesser people, because Brendan was a star around which the mere mortals like us just orbited, you know.
5 months later, the plans were in place for Hughes to escape in a prison bin lorry.
The arrangements were already made for me to be put into a mattress and just throw me in the back of the lorry. Eventually, they finished the run and the lorry was heading out. I get a picture of my own mind what the hell they were doing. They were ramming the thing it was a big spear. I was on the point of jumping up because, I mean, if the spear had hit me, it would have been right through me. But by pure chance, it missed me. But once that happened, I was out of the camp. I tried to cut the mattress and the knife, the small pen knife just bent back. So I began to panic. And I got my head out. And I never forget the breath of fresh air I took. I knew I had about a half an hour before the alarm bells went up. And I jumped into a taxi and asked the guy to drive me to Dundalk. All the time counting the minutes before the alarm bells went up. And the British Army stopped us at the roadblock.
You got any ID?
And all I had was a receipt from leather that was brought into the jail, no, for handiworks. I had a receipt for that with a name on it. And I thought, fuck, He waved us on. I was waiting for one in the back of the head. And that was the longest couple of minutes of my life. But once I knew it was across the border, I knew it was okay. I had done it, I had escaped.
By late 1973, David Ervine had become a bomber for the UVF. No warning bombs, tossed into Catholic bars, were the group's specialty.
The East Belfast unit would have carried out a lot of the pub bombings and shootings, the activity of people like David Ervine's unit.
Earlier, 2 gunmen had walked into Muldoon's bar. One planted a small bomb by the door and the other machine-gunned the customers.
You know, I was committed to it. There was no going back. There was never a moment when I said, have I done the right thing here? That never happened. I mean, it was a hamster wheel to hell. Not only did there seem no way off, I didn't want to get off. I wanted to get on with it.
A 30-pound bomb was left outside a pub in the predominantly Roman Catholic New Lodge area.
I've seen circumstances where the police messages were on in a pub and a bomb was off, and I knew where the target was. But once the police message in declared it was a nationalist target, the bar cheered. And little did they know that some of the people who'd been responsible were standing the boozer as well. We were watching this society of ours going to fucking hell. We lost our way, our society lost our way, not just the UVF lost its way.
The UVF's bombing campaign climaxed when they exploded no-warning car bombs in Dublin and Monaghan in May 1974. 33 people were killed.
I don't doubt there was massive support for it. Massive numbers in my community felt that it was dead on. In terms of returning the sheriff, in terms of saying, here, do you know what it's like? Now you know how we feel.
Later that year, David Ervine set out on a bombing mission of his own from his base in East Belfast.
I'd left up the Hollywood Road heading for Hollywood with no reason to believe that I wouldn't make it. I was in a vehicle on my own.
Give me the keys to the boot. Bomb. It's got a bomb in the boot. Get out of the fucking car now.
Bomb disposal officers had a look at the device, and what I did was step forward with a rope tied around me, and tied around for the captain, ATO, Army Technical Officer. He trained a pistol on me and asked me to open the vehicle in a very express and specific sequence. And the theory was if you got a sequence wrong, I'll shoot you. I lifted the device out and sat on the footpath, and they took it away eventually and disposed of it. I was charged with possession of explosives with intent to endanger life. I was sentenced to 11 years.
David never talked about his involvement with me in the UVF. I wouldn't have known until that particular time when David was arrested. And I was just devastated. And I was angry with him. Because I felt that I never would have made a decision that it would have affected both our lives so profoundly. I would never have done that to him, and I felt that he shouldn't have done it to me.
After Brendan Hughes' escape, British Army surveillance of West Belfast was so intense that he couldn't operate from his old stomping grounds.
We had to find a new avenue, and the new avenue was to move into middle-class areas and to take on new identities. I took on the new identity of Arthur McAllister and dressed like a businessman, carried a briefcase. My only agenda at that period in the 70s was to fight a war, to plant as many bombs as I could, to rob as many banks as I could, to kill as many Brits and RUC as I could, to develop the war and to a higher level than it was. I was good at what I'd done, and I'd done it.
Brendan Hughes had been arrested before, but today's arrest may give a clue to a new tactic by the IRA of using middle-class hideouts. Hughes was dressed in a smart stockbroker-style suit.
When he was captured the second time, I remember going into the house. Of course, he was caught there in his three-piece suit, looking very debonair, not the ragged-haired pseudo-philanthropist of the police RUC photos.
Inside the house and garage, police found weapons, maps, plans for bomb attacks, bomb-making equipment, and a large number of timing devices.
British Army were boasting about it for days, weeks afterwards. Especially since he'd escaped from Long Kesh beforehand, you know. We've recaught him.
Hughes and Ervine were now both in Long Kesh. Hughes was reunited with Gerry Adams, while Ervine was hearing some unconventional political ideas.
The day that I arrived in Long Kesh, I was met by Gusty Spence. I can remember sitting and minding my own business in the compound and Gusty Spence coming over and, "How you doing, son?" "I'm doing all right, sir, thank you very much." And we start talking about politics.
When the rest of the prisoners playing football in the compound, that sort of stuff, you'd have seen the clouds of peace coming out through Gusty's cubicle, where him and Davy would have been talking on the pipe each and discussing politics.
Ervine told me that Gusty Spence was essential to forming his political opinions. Opened his eyes to the possibility of power sharing with nationalists, which would hitherto for him have been an inconceivable idea.
But 2 decades later, sharing power with nationalists would be adopted as official policy by the UVF.
Spence was way ahead of the game, and he was almost a provocateur. I mean, I think the core power-sharing politics of the PUP has its antecedents in Long Kesh.
Meanwhile, in Long Kesh's Cage 11, Hughes and Adams were at the centre of an intense political debate about the state of the IRA.
The movement on the outside was in disarray. The British had mounted major successes in their arrests. Most of the operators were all in jail, and the leadership were left with no direction whatsoever.
Then the Dublin-based leadership called an open-ended ceasefire. This was the last straw.
They were opposed to the 1975 ceasefire because it was open-ended, and they didn't believe that the British were serious about disengagement.
People like myself and Gerry realised that this has to be stopped one way or the other. We walked the yard conspiring about trying to get rid of this leadership, because this leadership was leading us up the garden path.
When Adams was released in 1977, the plan to revitalise the Republican movement was ready.
The last words that Gerry said to me walking out the gate with his bag was that I was the lucky one, staying behind, that he had a much harder job than me on the outside.
Prior to 1977, IRA prisoners were effectively prisoners of war. And in 1977, the British decided to treat all prisoners as criminals.
According to the prisoners, they were beaten and harassed by prison officers when they were on their way to the toilets. And when they were not allowed to slop out their chamber pots, they began smearing excrement on the cell walls.
The attack came at 8:20 last night when the Miles family heard a knock at the door. The gunman fired straight past Mrs. Miles at her husband, who'd also come out into the hall.
There can be no question of political status for someone who is serving a sentence for crime. Crime is crime is crime.
What's left really no alternative but to look into the abyss, and the abyss was actually a hunger strike.
We decided we would take volunteers from each county if possible to maximise the support in the 6 counties.
This morning, 7 men in 8 blocks 3, 4 and 5 refused their normal choice of breakfast. The 7 said it had been their own decision and that the hunger strike would be to the death.
As commander of the IRA prisoners, Hughes became the leader of the hunger strike.
Well, I remember the first day of the hunger strike, and we came and left the food at the door of the cell. And I remember the feeling then of looking around the cell and saying to myself, this is the first day of the last day of my life.
The hunger strike by 7 Republican prisoners at the Maze prison continued today.
But so far there are no indications of any fresh moves to get the men off their hunger strike. The SDL
has called on the British Prime Minister Mrs Thatcher to intervene personally in the worsening crisis.
Marchers came from the 4 corners of Ireland to voice their protest in support of the hunger strike in the Maze, which is now in its 41st day.
With his condition deteriorating, Hughes was visited by his father and the journalist Tim Pat Coogan.
I remember my father just staring at me, because I had long hair and a long beard, and dirty, filthy. I hadn't washed in over 2 years. But Tim Pat Coogan asked the question, did I think I was going to die? And my father broke down, crying. I think it was the first time in my life I ever seen my father crying, except at the time when my mother died. In the body, it'll eat off all the fat tissue first, and then it starts eating away at the muscle to keep your brain alive. When that all goes, all that's left is your brain. And that starts to go as well, and that's when the brain damage sets in. I can still smell, and there is a smell when you're dying. There's a death smell. And it hung over the hospital the whole period during the hunger strike.
Nearly 50 days into the hunger strike, the British were in secret negotiations. But Hughes knew that in order to win their demands, the hunger strikers had to be willing to die.
Sean McKenna was the biggest problem. He was the weakest mentally and physically. One day he informed me that he didn't think he could die in the hunger strike. I told him I would not let him die.
It's an absolutely brutal way to die. That you realise perhaps this isn't for me. That you start seeing your life and you say, I'm not prepared to end my life. And you don't know that. You don't know that until you're well into it.
On the 53rd day of the hunger strike, Sean McKenna was nearing death. Hughes, whose own health was declining fast, faced a critical decision.
Dr. Ross, the main doctor, informed me that Sean had only hours to live. I shouted up after Dr. Ross, feed him.
Seven Republican prisoners have called off their hunger strike. The decision came at 7 o'clock this evening on the 53rd day of their fast.
The hunger strike was a failure. We did not win our demands. I remember coming out of the prison hospital and going back to the prison cell that I'd left and being totally and utterly demoralised and thinking if I had let Sean die, would it have ended the prison protest? I remember going through this whole nightmare. It was actually just as bad as the hunger strike itself. I was suicidal. And that went on for a long, long time after the hunger strike.
After 5.5 years in jail, David Ervine tried to rebuild a life with his family on the outside.
I was released in 1980. I remember preferring to walk into the town with my wife rather than get a bus. I was afraid of the bus. The noise was deafening. So many people about. It was actually quite strange.
When David came out of prison, I made it clear to him, if it ever happened again, that I wouldn't be standing by him. I wouldn't put my children or myself through that.
Came home very conscious of the fact that probably the greatest suffering out of my incarceration was by my wife and son.
Going to jail saved his marriage. He was more thoughtful, more politically aware.
Fundamentally, I think Lancash changed David Ervine. He decided to pump his brain. He did O-levels, A-levels, and an open university degree.
I got myself sorted out, got work, and started to honour my responsibilities. I became a milkman, would you believe?
In the H blocks, Bobby Sands had replaced Brendan Hughes as leader of the IRA prisoners.
Bobby had indicated to me that he was going to go on another hunger strike. I disagreed with him at the time. Up until this period, I was always in some sort of position of influence, and this time I was just another number.
He knew that Bobby was leading it, and he's saying to Bobby, Bobby, you're going to die, and it's still not going to work.
Once again, we have a hunger strike at the Maze prison in the quest for what they call political status. There is no such thing as political murder, political bombing, or political violence. We will not compromise on this. There will be no political status.
Soon after Bobby Sands began his fast, the Fermanagh and South Tyrone Westminster seat became vacant, and he stood for election.
Sands, Bobby, anti-H block, Armagh, political prisoner, 30,492.
Bobby Sands is now the validly elected MP for Fermanagh South Tyrone.
The election victory of Bobby Sands was an earthquake event. It was a turning point in the Republican movement's campaign.
The result didn't move Margaret Thatcher. After 66 days without food, Bobby Sands died. His funeral was the largest seen in Ireland for decades. Over the next 5 months, Hughes remembered watching helplessly from his cell as 9 more hunger strikers followed Bobby Sands to their deaths.
The leadership on the outside should have intervened. I felt like an outsider. I felt depressed. I was still a passenger on this moving train that was slowly killing people off. For years, I mean, I couldn't even talk about it because I couldn't face the fact that 10 men had died. I found it very, very hard to live with myself because I felt that possibly I should have been dead rather than the other 10 men.
Meanwhile, in East Belfast, David Ervine had re-established his connection to the UVF, who had founded a new political party.
It must have been about 83 when I got a rap at the door. It was two people from the Progressive Unionist Party, and then they had, I think, been alerted to my barroom oratory and came to see whether or not I would be interested in joining the PUP, which I subsequently did.
The approach was made at the direction of his old prison mentor, Gusty Spence.
Gusty Spence encouraged David Ervine to be a reasonable voice of the UVF, if that's not a misnomer, and at the same time to develop politically with the PUP, and once it was opportune, to come out of the shadows.
Outside the prison, Hughes' old friend Gerry Adams became a national figure by building on the election success of Bobby Sands. He won the West Belfast seat for Sinn Féin. By the time Brendan Hughes was released from prison in 1986, Sinn Féin was on Ireland's political map.
After I got out of jail, I actually lived with Gerry in his house in the Glen Road.
The old relationship between Hughes and Adams was quickly re-established.
I trusted the man at that time, and I trusted his political manoeuvring and his political direction.
When he got out of prison, his wife had gone, his children had gone. So he was sort of dependent on people like Gerry to sort of see where he's going to fit in.
After Brendan Hughes was reintegrated into the IRA, he found an organisation in decay.
At that time, I didn't know what was going on, but there was been a rundown taking place within the IRA. And I didn't realise then that the army was probably being run down purposely.
As they went through the 1980s, more of the resources were put into the political side, and Adams was pushing for that. And this led to considerable tensions within the Provisional IRA and the Republican movement.
Hughes thought the neglect of the IRA had left it both weakened and compromised.
I think what convinced Brendan was his major operations were coming apart and a lot of people were being arrested, as if the movement was heavily infiltrated.
Undercover British soldiers opened fire on the three IRA men from several vantage points, raking their car with gunfire.
There was a major problem with informants. By the late 80s, there was an awful sense of mistrust. One of the jobs that I took on was to try and find informers.
Brendan Hughes' new assignment with IRA intelligence brought him face to face with a situation in Belfast that would seriously shake his belief in the IRA. It started when he was offered a free house to live in.
A friend of mine brought me to an estate agent called Joe Fenton. And I just immediately got suspicious. I didn't take it. I didn't take the house. Then I started to look into the background of the other people that Fenton got houses for.
Hughes discovered that Fenton had for years been supplying houses to top IRA personnel in Belfast.
All the houses were bugged, and that was the precondition that they got the houses, that the Brits moved in first and bugged the house.
One of the bugged houses belonged to Harry Burns, the commander of the Belfast IRA.
I had a major run-in with Harry in his own house. Then, Harry warned Fenton that I was checking into him. Fenton done a runner. He went to England on the pretext of going to a boxing match. He was told to return by his handlers. Fenton returned to Belfast and was immediately executed by the IRA before I could get to interrogate him.
Immediately after the murder, the Provisionals claimed Joe Fenton was an informant.
I believe he was executed to protect someone bigger than him. I got actually very frightened that I discovered something here that was murky, was high level, and I was getting no help from anybody in Belfast. I didn't trust Belfast. Belfast was rotten. It was fucking riddled with leaks, with informers.
From what I saw at my end of the process, in terms of the information that was being circulated, Hughes did have every reason to be worried. There was very little that happened at any level of the IRA that wasn't actually reported. And there was a lot that was being reported.
Hughes recalled turning to his friend Gerry Adams for help.
I sat and talked to Gerry. And Gerry says I was getting a wee bit paranoid, that I was exaggerating. I just didn't know who to trust anymore. I knew my life was in danger, not from loyalists, not from British, but from IRA personnel. So after that I left. I went to Dublin.
Years later, it was alleged that the IRA unit that killed Joe Fenton was under the command of two reputed British agents, Freddie Scappaticci, codenamed Steak Knife, and John Joe McGee, the man who, in 1969, recruited Brendan Hughes into the IRA. Unknown to Hughes and the majority of the IRA, by the late 1980s, Gerry Adams had been involved in secret talks with the British and Irish governments for a number of years.
A whole panoply of secret negotiations were taking place between government contacts in Dublin, linked people through to London. And people like Brendan Hughes knew absolutely nothing about it.
It was the ultimate high-wire act. To Hughes and the IRA, Adams was perceived as a hardline man of war, but his top-secret communications with British and Irish officials centred around ending the conflict.
It was hard to believe at first. The UVF pro-experts were struggling with what must have been going on within the Republican movement, but we all came to the same conclusion: the game's on.
Knowing that the IRA leadership secretly wanted a way out, the UVF decided on a strategy of intimidating Republicans into a ceasefire.
The one card that loyalists knew they had was the capacity to inflict violence. The idea was to escalate the war to end the war, which is what effectively they began to do.
The UVF were enlisted to persuade people into the peace process by making the price of staying out of it too high.
The UVF targeted IRA members in areas where opposition to a ceasefire would be strongest.
There was no question that East Tyrone was actually selected as an area where the UVF felt they needed to attack, that if it was going to be problems in the peace process, this is where it was going to come from.
UVF gunmen shot dead a Sinn Féin member, Tommy Casey.
The UVF killers alleged the others were in the IRA.
The UVF alleged Liam Ryan was in the IRA and said he was there.
Many nationalists suspected that the UVF were getting help and direction from the British intelligence services.
Security forces accused by locals of complicity in the attack.
It is a mistake to portray David Ervine as a pacifist. He was not. He was an unapologetic supporter of the UVF at that period.
I think that did create a huge fear factor in the Republicans, and really, for the first time, the Republicans had felt themselves being hounded.
The British government is prepared to enter into preliminary exploratory dialogue with Sinn Féin within 3 months, when cessation of violence has been clearly established.
As of midnight tonight, there will be a complete cessation of military operations.
Today's announcement was the signal for wild celebrations as news spread that the IRA campaign was to end.
British government got the IRA in a position they've always tried to do. They tried it in 72, they tried it in 75, failed both times. But unfortunately, the Brits haven't gone away.
But you don't condemn Adams for stopping the war?
No, I don't condemn him for it. I criticise him for it, for the devious way that it was all brought about. There were people still dying when they were talking. And these people who were dying, they should have known what was taking place. And I don't believe another 30 years of death is an answer to the previous 30 years.
Combined Loyalist Military Command will universally cease all operational hostilities as from 12 midnight.
The building of a future in Northern Ireland will be baby steps, be small, sensitive steps.
The most fundamental issue for the UVF was a single issue. It was the principle of consent. Well, the UVF got what it wanted.
By reaching an agreement in this room, all the parties did what many people said couldn't be done.
And Gerry Adams, along with loyalist leaders such as David Ervine, have opened a promising new gateway to a just and lasting peace.
Shortly after the Good Friday Agreement, Brendan Hughes moved into a small apartment in Divis Tower, in the heart of the Lower Falls.
Brendan loved the Falls Road. He loved that place where he was brought up, where he fought. He had some peace there, you know. No, we used to call it a cell, but he had some peace in it, you know.
Hughes began to openly criticise the Republican leadership and its political direction.
What the IRA and Sinn Féin have done has just become another middle-class party and dropped all the important things that we fought and died for, mainly the enhancement and the betterment of the working class people in Ireland.
It upset Hughes that many of his old comrades now shunned him, and he was deeply dismayed by Gerry Adams' denial that he had ever been a member of the IRA.
The fact of the matter is that we fought a war for 30 years. It means that people like myself had to carry the responsibility of all those deaths. Gerry was a major player in the war, and yet he's standing there denying it.
Following the Good Friday Agreement, David Ervine was elected to the new assembly. His peace process reputation opened doors for him far and wide.
I think the fruit is there for all to see. I mean, structured violence has ended. All of us are in uncharted waters. And I would be extremely confident that the people of Northern Ireland will see peace.
Road in the heart of Loyalist East Belfast, 800 mourners packed into the Methodist Mission Church for David Ervine's funeral service.
Yeah, I think that history will view David Ervine very well. He wasn't in the political scene that long, but for the length of time he was in it, I think he will come out very well.
David Ervine has become an iconic figure of the peace process. That hurts many people, particularly those people who have been injured by loyalist paramilitaries, who have lost loved ones by paramilitaries. But, you know, it's easy to talk about people sitting around in circles, holding hands and singing, "Make me a channel of your peace." The real peacemakers are the protagonists. And when the protagonists engage in the peace process, that's when we know we can deliver.
Perhaps the most significant presence was that of the Sinn Féin president, Gerry Adams, who offered his condolences to David Ervine's wife, Jeanette.
We had a good life. Yeah, we all have our ups and downs, and on the whole we had a good life. Loved each other deeply, and I'll always love him.
Well, I probably think the last sort of 12 months of Brendan's life, he was depressed. He probably didn't look after himself like he should have.
Brendan became very tired easily. He had 1 or 2 heart attacks. I think the hunger strikes and everything else had taken their toll on his body.
If you look at Brendan's life in total, the short part of life he had was in the Merchant Navy. Everything else in that was our war, on the run, being beaten, being on hunger strike, and then, probably the worst of all, was being disowned by your own. But he lost the ra, he lost everything.
A few months before Brendan died, he sent for me. He says, you make sure that Gerry Adams or the Provisional IRA or Sinn Féin don't have nothing to do with my funeral. I was asked at the time when we were going through with the funeral, could Gerry Adams take a lift? And I said yes. All the photographs of Brendan's funeral was Gerry Adams. As if him and Brendan had become friends again, you know. And I should have said no, but I relented and made a mistake and said yes.
As Gerry said himself, he says he went for respect. And so he should, you know what I mean? Because Brendan played a big part in this war. And you don't get peace unless you have a war. Somebody has to make the war for you to be a peacemaker.